Hello, and welcome to this session on championing DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Over the past 2 years, we've seen a sustained focus on engaging authentically around diversity, equity, and inclusion, both in and outside of the workplace. And while many organizations have made some progress, most still have gaps and vulnerabilities that present considerable risks amid a war for talent. For this group of panelists, our speakers will take us through DEI, how it is implemented, and the ROI ROC that transparency, engagement, and accountability around DEI commitments can attract top talent and grow customer loyalty. The session will be split into two parts with Peter Grau, chairman of Bloomberg and also founding chairman of the American chapter of the 30% Club, going into a one-to-one interview with Dr. Amy Morris, CEO of Maybank Investment Banking Group. The interview will center around raising the DEI agenda within ASEAN. This is then quickly followed by Dato Amy moderating a second group of panelists, which count Dr. Sorbol of the Stock Exchange of Thailand, Lo Chin Lu from Age Strategy, and Dr. Yeo King Kit of Bursa Malaysia to talk about the connection between DEI and sustainable businesses. Dato Amy, Peter, over to you, please.
Thank you, Seng Yao. As this is my seventh Invest ASEAN, I thought it appropriate to talk about the DEI sweet spot, the diversity, equity, and inclusion sweet spot, which in my view is the successful convergence of leadership, policy, data, and advocacy, a true and compelling business case. So, Peter, aside from our visual differences of you being a white male and me being an Asian female, our bond in this conversation is that we are both chairs of the 30% Club, you for the US and me for Malaysia. Whichever regime of quotas or disclosures that prevail, in my view, we as chairs obviously both believe in two things. Firstly, that advocacy plays a pivotal role in driving, if not accelerating, the agenda of DEI on boards and amongst top leadership. And secondly, that whilst we strive to advocate for conscious capital and conscious corporate leadership, change doesn't happen without pressure. And as since 2014, when you took on the chair of the 30% Club in the US, I don't think it was accidental that you also put the stake in the ground in the same year to also take the lead on the DEI agenda as the chairman of Bloomberg. So what got you here, Peter, and what two things have driven you the most?
Well, Amy, thank you so much for this opportunity. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't thank you and your colleagues at the bank for your great support that you give Bloomberg and our colleagues in Southeast Asia. So first and foremost, let me say thank you. The background for me, and I know we all have our different situations and perspectives on these things, but my mother was the most important person in my life. She died at 93 in 2006, but was my strongest advocate, my harshest critic. She was always there when I needed her. She did some unusual things that affected life events with me. And so I always had I also have two sisters, but Mom was really the kind of key player in it all. Since I've been at Bloomberg, the single most important person from a partnership point of view has been my chief of staff, Kate Schroeder, who's been with me for over 20 years. And I've had a series on my team of extremely capable women in virtually every aspect of our business that you could think of. And as a consequence, whenever I had a big decision, I've had a large decision to make, particularly when I was chief executive officer from 2002 through 2011, I would always welcome their opinion and ask them for their views about different subjects, because it brought a much different perspective to the way I would think about a specific situation. And you're well aware, we are, as a company, very much a derivative of Wall Street, which means it is largely a company dominated by white male men. And obviously, we've tried to change that. So by way of background, I've seen the benefit from a personal and professional point of view of having very thoughtful, well-informed, hardworking female colleagues or family members that have had a very positive impact on the decision-making of key issues that I've had to address while I've been at Bloomberg. The second thing that I would say, which is true for all of us, and that is we at Bloomberg, we employ just under 22,000 people in over 130 countries around the world, with largest concentration in the major financial centers. But we are in a war for talent every day. In 2022, we will hire roughly 5,000 new people into Bloomberg. And as a consequence of that dynamic, we basically have to create an open and inclusive environment to attract all underrepresented groups as well as highly represented groups. And on the underrepresented groups, that includes women, that includes people of color, in some instances, people of different geographies, different sexual orientation, different disabilities, abilities/disabilities. And in addition to recruiting them, the primary responsibility we then have is to deploy them effectively and basically create an environment where they can feel comfortable after we've recruited them, that we are retaining them, that we're developing them, and that we're basically listening to the things that they have to say, that we can do our jobs better. So for us, the issue of diversity and inclusion, regardless of how you come at it, is a critically important part of our human capital strategy. And the third thing that I would say, and I'm sure that you are very much invested in this as well as I am, the tone has to be set at the top of the organization. And there has to be a framework developed so that individual, in our case, contributors, team leaders, managers, senior managers, and business leaders all basically feel a responsibility for executing that strategy effectively.
So Peter, I mean, you obviously, have basically your position is that DEI, right, is really a battle for talent. So let's get to the hot part of the conversation. We also know there have been numerous studies from all parts of the world that have demonstrated that better diversity leads to better performance. And this is irrespective of whether the diversity has been achieved by combinations of quotas, KPIs, corporate governance codes, or by required disclosures and shareholder-driven initiatives by the likes of BlackRock and also Malaysia's Employee Provident Fund, for example. So yes, progress has been made, but data indicates, as you well know, that the achievement is plateauing in terms of that critical mass of 30%. Let alone to achieve the parity of 50%. After all, women do make up 50% of the population, and most universities have 50% or more women students. So, as a male and a male chair, what is it that business leaders, why is it that business leaders are not pushing their agenda if there's a clear business case, and also given the slew of tools that are deployable? What would be your personal message to the your fellow male chairs and also CEOs who are tuning into the session today?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. The first thing that I would say is what we are attempting to do collectively is evolutionary, it's not revolutionary. This is something that is a cultural shift within our organizations and our industry. And it's going to take a long period of time to get to the end game. And there's going to be some positive momentum. There are going to be some things that set us back, like George Floyd and what's been happening with Black lives in the United States. So it's not going to be a straight line up by any stretch of the imagination. The phrase that I like to use is that we are in a race without a finish line. And persistence is the primary responsibility of leadership. And in the context of that persistence, basically holding people accountable and being able to provide the data that basically will show whether they're making progress or they aren't making progress. One of the other things that we have talked about, and certainly a number of companies like BlackRock, which you referred to before, has done, and that is in their senior leadership team, a certain portion of their incentive compensation is tied to how they do from a D&I perspective within their respective businesses going forward. And so I think the framework against which people are being held accountable is becoming clearer and clearer as we put in time trying to make a significant change in this human capital strategy. But as I said, it's not going to happen overnight. You know, there are a lot of things that we have tried to do. With our global equity index, which is, we now have 418 companies from over, I think, 32 countries representing $12 trillion in assets that fill out a 65-question survey on an annual basis, basically about their female colleagues in the workplace. And there are many more people who submit. There are a number of companies that once they've gone through the exercise, they don't qualify to be part of the index because they fall short on some of the scoring that is applied to individual issues. So there are a number of ways that we're trying to really crystallize in the leadership structure of our company, as I know you are in your company, so that people understand this is just part of the deal. It is our responsibility to our shareholders to have the best people in our companies that we possibly can have. And to have them, they have to be diverse, they have to be able to work inclusively, and they have to be held accountable for the job that they do. And if not, we need to move on and make some changes.
So, Peter, just taking on from that, right? So the Russell 1000, for example, right? It only has 3% of board seats with at least 50% women. So if we actually subscribe to the idea that change only happens with pressure, right? Or rather, it takes pressure to impact change. You know, are there any specific kinds of pressure that you think that, you know, as chairs of 30% Club, for example, that we can you know, assert to accelerate the change?
Yes, I think there definitely is. And I've done it here in the United States with a number of the big institutional investors. Going to the Goldman Sachs asset managements and going to the BlackRocks and going to the Schroders and going to the Axes and other big asset management firms, and basically having them exercise their influence, in many cases as large equity holders of individual companies, by having a sit-down session with the CEO and his or her team to talk about the relative importance of accelerating their D&I programs going forward. Because in the end, they are the institutional investment community is the beneficiary of that work, because performance will be better, valuations will improve by definition, and stock prices will go up. And so I think that's a critically important thing. I have not been a strong advocate for quotas. You're well aware that Sweden, France, and a number of other Western European countries have gone to a quota mechanism. I think there should be enough incentive to the leadership of companies and their boards by enabling this to happen so that the performance is better, that you don't have to go for quotas. But there are other more stringent mechanisms that you could impose, which I think could be quite helpful to this issue going forward.
Yes, I understand that, you know, for the US approach is really not skewed towards quotas, but much more of a bottom-up approach. And so that brings me also to data, right? So one of the key indices that globally people follow is, of course, the Gender Equality Index. And I'm very proud to also share, Peter, that Maybank is also one of the 418 companies out of the from 45 countries that is included in that index. So from your vantage point as chairman of Bloomberg, are there any particular lessons or recipes for success that you have seen from the data that you have aggregated that may be relevant and should perhaps be also emulated in the Asian context, for example?
Well, I think the survey is pretty much universal because everyone is confronted by the same challenges. So I think that's quite straightforward. You know, what started out 6 or 7 years ago, we literally started with 30 financial services institutions, and as you thoughtfully articulated, we're now have 418 reporting companies who are part of the index, and it is a big deal for us to be able to do this and deliver the end product as we go forward. And it is all part of what I think you mentioned, and we were talking about a little bit earlier, and that is, you know, as Mike Bloomberg would say, you know, without data, how do we know how to attack a problem? So we're getting more and more data. You know, what's going on with ESG and the scoring that's going on is obviously being more broadly applied than just some of the fundamental for-profit business indicators that exist. I think that we will, as time goes by, we'll get more and more high-quality data and historical reference data. We can really judge performance. And you as a bank with your clients and the other big asset managers around the world can effectively use that in making their contributing to their investment decisions going forward.
So, you know, following on from the subject of data, for example, right? Perhaps, you know, some of the key data points that perhaps I could share here is, for example, right? Women hold 40% of global wealth. They make close to 70% of decisions on household spending. And women also are 2 times more likely to consider ESG in investments. So I guess in a recent report by Oliver Wyman, together with the 30% Club, it was also highlighted that women are the most likely change makers for urgent issues, and particularly in our times today, one such urgent issue is, of course, climate action. But women are still underrepresented as decision makers, as we all know. So Peter, like, you know, let's do a what if we could imagine a world of gender parity in terms of boardrooms and corporate leadership. What are the 2 things perhaps you think we could imagine if women were unleashed as change agents?
I think better decision making. I think an issue that I am keenly interested in and have been involved in since I started with Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum about 12 years ago, something called the Community of Chairpersons, is basically the continued promotion of women into positions of responsibility. I think, you know, one of the things that I've learned, I have a program that I've led for almost the last decade at Bloomberg, where I take 12 colleagues a year. They're all high performance, high potential, 6 men, 6 women. They're people of color. They're people of different sexual orientation, disabilities, and geographies. They all have bright futures ahead of them. And this is a way for the firm, through the chairman, to basically say to them, they're important. We're going to invest in your future, and that your future is critically needed in our company to continue to have the kind of record results that we've been lucky enough to enjoy since our company started 41 years ago. What I have found is a reluctance for female colleagues to raise their hand for a promotion opportunity before a male colleague will. The men, if they feel 15 or 20% prepared to take on the responsibility, will say, Amy, I can do it. I know I can do it. And Kate, for example, will raise her hand and say, well, you know, I'm 85% sure I can do the job, but that other 15% is kind of, I just don't feel comfortable putting my hand up. Part of our responsibility in leadership is to basically promote people earlier on in their careers, because 9 times out of 10, what we have found is that they have done incredibly good jobs with that new responsibility. And it has accelerated their development as business leaders going forward and as great representatives of our firm. And so part of the responsibility, I think, falls on us in leadership to push these things through more aggressively than we have in the past. Because the other thing that I would say, and I'm absolutely positive this is true with you, Amy Morris, and that is female colleagues in your bank look up to you and say, boy, if she can do it, why can't I do it? And so on top of everything else, we need role models who are prepared to invest the additional time and effort to meet with younger colleagues and affinity groups, and really kind of pave the way for their self-confidence to be able to embrace further responsibility going forward. We have our biggest turnover. First of all, our female turnover is a little bit higher than our male turnover, but our biggest turnover tends to be between 3 and 6 years of employment. And in many cases, that's because life decisions are being made. Families are deciding to have children and all that goes with it. We also have to create an environment where they want to come back to work for us, so that we don't lose that investment in time, effort, and energy that we've made to give them the tools to continue to take on more responsibility as we go forward.
Peter, from all that you've said, it does sound like it is definitely a process of evolution. And I guess for somebody like me, it is a bit difficult sometimes to think that we are in 2022 and a large doses of pragmatism is still required. So, coming back to this evolution thing, right? I know that in Davos, you also spoke about biases and how, at Bloomberg, for example, you do have regular or annual trainings on biases, which is something that perhaps we don't talk enough about because people assume that they are aware and therefore they're conscious. But, as you know, biases, conscious and unconscious, have become very established. So, what are the things that you at your own, at Bloomberg, what kind of training do you actually offer and provide so that people are really aware and really pick up on things that don't really serve the cause, so to speak?
Yeah, so we do annual bias training for all of our employees. And so it covers not only individual contributors, pardon me, but managers and leaders as we go forward. We have developed a series of programs called our goal programs, which are basically focused initially on underrepresented groups. So we have a series of them going on in Asia now, very much focused on basically dealing with bias, but also using that as a foundation of building your leadership philosophy and leadership capabilities going forward. We hold our folks accountable in their semi-annual and annual performance evaluations. We have questions and comments that they have to give with regard to bias training. And so it's pretty much integrated into the kind of the growth of a manager to make sure that we've got that bias training and they're aware of these things. And I think we do a pretty good job at it. But as is the case with all of this, we can always do better.
Peter, it's been really, very insightful to hear your views and also to, hear with conviction of the journey that we continue to take on. So a final question from me. So what would be one word that you would pick to really inspire diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Gosh, that is, I get asked those types of questions all the time. So I think if I had to pick one word, I think I'd pick the word collaboration, because we're not going to achieve our objectives unless different groups collaborate effectively to build spirit and build community within the organization, with the ultimate goal of obviously making an important contribution to society. I know that's part of the foundation of your bank, but I think collaboration for all of us is critically important. And if I had the opportunity to say one other word, culture is critically important. And since we're about to say goodbye to one another, the last thing that I would say is it is really incumbent upon you and me and other leaders to set the tone at the top and create a set of standards that we will hold our colleagues accountable to as we go forward, because this is as every bit as important as our capital allocation strategy, our sales growth, our expense control, our involvement in the local communities, the higher purpose that we serve as organizations. It all comes together, but the foundation that's really going to drive it is basically collaboration amongst different colleagues across the firm with a common objective of basically improving Maybank, improving Bloomberg, and how we deal within the communities in which we operate around the world.
Yeah, certainly, on behalf of Maybank, we really, really would like to thank you for joining us at Invest ASEAN. Our mission statement is humanizing financial services, and we really do believe in being the force for good. So Peter Grauer, thank you so much for joining us, and we will hand over the next panel, which consists of the stock exchanges of the region. Thank you again, Peter.
Thanks, Amy. I'm very pleased to be of help.
A very good morning, everybody. So we have just heard from Peter, the chairman of Bloomberg and the chair of the 30% Club US, that DEI is all about winning the battle for talent. And in this session, the part 2 of this conversation, we have with us DEI champions in ASEAN, who are in pursuit of raising the bar in competitiveness. So we will seek to uncover some of these following questions with our panelists. Where are we right now when it comes to DEI? What are the best practices in ASEAN when it comes to DEI? And how can we frame the future of DEI to enable it to flourish? Allow me to introduce our panelists for today. We have Dr. Ken Yeoh, the Vice President of Corporate Governance and Sustainability at Bursa Malaysia. Good morning, Ken. We have Dr. Sorapol Tulayasatien, Head of Corporate Strategy and Sustainable Market Development at the Stock Exchange of Thailand. Sawadika, Kun Sarapol. And we have Lo Chin Lu, a former banker, the very proud Asia Pacific Strategic Advisor at Edge Strategy and Strategic Engagement Chair of Singapore's Financial Women's Association. Thank you for making time for us at Invest ASEAN. So let me begin by really setting the context. Where are we really now? Where do we stand at the moment in terms of women on boards of our listed companies? So from my understanding is that women hold about 21% of board seats of all PLCs in Thailand, Kun Sorapol. 18% in Malaysia, Dr. Ken, and about 13% in Singapore, Chin Lu. So of course, diversity is not just about gender. We are very, very mindful and cognizant of that. There was a question earlier also asking about other types of representation. Now, diversity is also very much about other aspects, including age and expertise, but perhaps, in my view, with gender being the most visible. So we just heard from Peter Grauer that DEI is about the battle for talent. So maybe I'll start with Dr. Sorapol. Kun Sorapol, what regulatory plans does the Stock Exchange of Thailand have going forward with regards to broadening out gender diversity in Thai boardrooms and corporate leadership, for example?
Thank you, Amy, for the questions. As we have heard from Peter, that the important things that need to be done is that there need to be tone from the top. And for Thailand case, there is a tone from the top from our regulator, the Security Exchange Commission, SEC. They have the goal in mind to have at least 30% of listed company having at least 30% of the women representative on board. So that is the tone from the very top from our regulator. On the stock exchange level, we try to encourage this development in 4 steps. The first step, of course, is that we want to have the standard setting. We want to have a guideline for listed companies to follow, because sometimes in terms of diversity, there are many questions on what to do or how to do or what are the best way to do. So having a guideline is the best way for companies to have the easy checklist, say that this one they have done it or not. So we have done that. We have published a guideline, and then we need to build capacity building for the companies. So we have done the workshop. We have done collaboration with, for example, UN Women or this event to promote awareness that it is in the interest of the companies to do it. There are evidence that you have presented in the beginning that female leaders tend to be more broader in view in the decision making. So we have some of that present. And then we also need to have assessment, because you never know if you have achieved the goal or not if you don't assess, and you have to have the company disclose on the status of what they do. And I think the most important thing is that as a Stock Exchange of Thailand, we also do it ourselves, because we're not just telling others what to do, but we also do it ourselves. For the management at the Stock Exchange of Thailand, there are 44% female representative.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that is above the target, but we understand that there are differences in company in different industries that they need to consider. So that's in short the 4 steps that we need to do: the guideline, capacity building, the evaluations, as well as the disclosure and set example.
Cool. Dr. Ken, I know that Bursa came out sometime last year with earlier this year with new issuers requirements for women board representation, right? So what more can we expect from Bursa in terms of pushing the agenda, pushing the needle on DEI, be it at board level or senior management?
Well, Amy, thank you very much firstly for having us. Firstly, you're absolutely right in saying that diversity actually transcends gender, and we should embrace diversity in all its shapes and forms. But even so, we do acknowledge that when it comes to corporate boards and leadership, the narrative and focus has largely revolved around the gender dimension. So in January this year, Bursa Malaysia has actually enhanced its listing requirements, where all PLCs are required to have at least one woman on their boards. We believe that this is the right step forward because, according to our observations, once one woman joins an all-male board, that inertia and that cultural barrier is broken. And we hope to see some degree of normalization over time, where subsequent appointments of women directors becomes a business as usual. So when you view it from such an angle, having at least one director on every board represents not just a significant milestone in itself, but also a catalyst to ultimately get to our target of 30%. Other initiatives that are supportive of this will be our attempts to get more data points as well as transparency that will give us a more comprehensive yet nuanced view of diversity across all levels of the organization. I'm sure you're aware that Bursa is in the midst of enhancing our sustainability reporting framework, and two of the key proposals include the mandating of a set of disclosures, common themes and indicators. And for the adopted indicators, we're also proposing to require explicit performance targets to be set. So of course, one of the common themes that we have identified is diversity. And related indicators include, employees by gender, age, disability, etc. for each employee category. And this applies to directors as well. So we will give the whole market that visibility. Now, of course, tighter regulation alone does not provide the full answer. So just like SET, we have also tried to tackle the other major impediments and challenges, such as growing the talent pipeline. In particular, increasing the number of suitably qualified board candidates for women. So we have to say that 30% Club Malaysia has contributed significantly on this front over the years.
Thank
Now,
you.
on the part of the exchange, we have also undertaken a host of advocacy programs, again, just like SET, and are also leading by example. The proportion of women on our board is also way above 30%. And similar to Maybank, we are also a constituent on the Bloomberg's Gender Equality Index.
So maybe that's a good segue from what Dr. Sorapol and Dr. Ken have mentioned in terms of where the regulatory perspectives are. Chin Lu, so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think we have a fairly good grounding and understanding around diversity and inclusion. But on equity, maybe that's something that tends to perhaps be overlooked or perhaps less emphasized, at least from my perspective, because if perhaps not enough women are in the energy sector, for example, if there are not enough women in STEM, and also not enough women in boardrooms, how much of it is about, say, making sure headhunters now we naturally ask, to ask them to make sure that there is a diverse list of candidates. What about more at the upstream, right? What about making sure that the panel of interviewers, the selection panel, is also embodying certain principles and making sure that there's equity, open access, for example, equal access? Perhaps some of the data that the EDGE follows and measures can shed a bit more light on equity.
Sure, yeah. Thank you firstly for the invitation. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Maybank and 30% Club for a chance to be on this panel. My previous speakers are regulators, and they shared of the work in progress that they hope will move the needle in terms of D&I and gender being one piece, but also other intersectionality of diversity. So from our part, I don't represent SGX here, but I represent a company that firmly believes that D&I can be a process that's embedded into corporate culture. So on the point of, let's say, equity, right, diversity, I think is quite well established, and inclusion is being part of that. But on equity, I think how we look at it in terms of helping companies, structure and approach DEI in a more structured way, is that companies can embed, DEI into the processes. So I think, Kun Sarapal did mention that processes is important. You have to build that into corporate culture. And for us, it can be broken down into elements of equity, looking at various forms and different representations of equity. So for example, how we look at it is in 4 key buckets. So representation, make sure you get, for example, equal balanced representation of gender, of males and females in organizations all the way to the board level. In pay equity, there should not be any difference in pay in the same type of job that's performed by men or women. So there should be pay equity. Also, in terms of being equitable in policies and practices, how does the organization measure the equity? And part of that would be, for example, to employee feedback. As you poll your employees, right, through either your annual engagement surveys or pulse surveys that companies, now increasingly use to poll their stakeholders, their own employees. They can ask targeted questions, right, to check whether policies and practices are equitable between men and women, and how they're used, or what is the feedback, and what is the experience, right, of using these policies. So these processes can be established into corporate culture, into corporate DNA, so much so that before long, this sort of way of doing things is a part of business DNA, and it would then shift the mindsets towards building a more equitable culture and organization.
Thanks, Chin Lu. So maybe I will take that across to Dr. Sorapal, right? So if having these robust DEI programs, DEI measurements, metrics, encoded in an organization's DNA, and that would somehow suggest that companies will have better performance, financial and non-financial, and perhaps that could also lead to better valuations as well, right? And I think that has also been somewhat suggested. So Dr. Sorapal, based on your experience on the Stock Exchange of Thailand and the PLCs there, what have you noticed? I know that in Thailand, you have mentioned that in certain industries, there is a especially in the financial sector, there is a very high representation of women. So what has your observation been, and has the SET have any data to support any of these observations, for example?
For Thailand, we have noticed that companies that promote diversity and equity and inclusion in their policy and in their everyday operation, they tend to be the company that are well recognized by the Thai society. I give you an example. For the disability case, we have a company, a jeweler, that hire people with hearing impairment for their jewelry, because sometimes they work in factories. It's actually a plus not to hear all this noise. We have a telecommunication company that hire people with blind sight disability to do the call center. And we have a company, leading company, a bank in Thailand that have a very high representation of female at the board level, as well as the management. The chairman and the CEO are female, and this bank is also quite performing quite well. And I think more importantly, when society recognize that company value diversity, I think this is a goodwill, and of course it has a positive feedback in the long run, and that's a true definition of the sustainability.
What about Bursa, Dr. Ken? Any good stories, any good observations?
Yeah, thank you, Amy. We actually undertake annual sustainability disclosure reviews and also have close engagements with our PLCs. What we've noticed is that those that have inclusive company cultures that translates into effective policies and an eye towards equal opportunities, and those with good ESG track records are those that have this equity in mind, because it is a conscious effort. And those companies that are more visible, and of course the bigger boys, are actually further along in this as compared to the smaller PLCs. So that's what we've noticed. Okay,
so Chin Lu, you mentioned that culture is extremely pivotal, right? So one of the topics of conversations that perhaps again stays somewhat below the radar, it's about building and nurturing safer work environments. So from your perspective, what are again some things that can provide signals or red flags that not all is well, and to ensure that all is better, for example?
Sure. I think in Singapore, there is quite a lot of effort by the Singapore government, right? And it's led by either NTUC or TAFEP, where they believe in fair workplace practices. So it was quite bold of the government to tackle, for example, sexual harassment as an issue within companies. And I think it could be a stigma, like how mental wellness was debunked and raised during COVID, which is an excellent thing, so that people that suffer from mental wellness, illness, will then be not afraid to come out in public to share the situation, and that companies can support them, right, by way of having, policies or some sort of, support for their workers. So in the same place as workplace fairness, tackling all issues of fairness in the workplace, be it making a safe environment, supporting, let's say, lactating mothers, different disabilities and so forth. It is an effort, right, to debunk some of these stigmas and to discuss this in public. So I think in terms of safe workplaces, companies must be able to address the elephant in the room. They must slaughter sacred cows. They must be bold, and there must be champions and role models, right, in the community, that will speak up on this fact. So I think for me, wearing the hat of EDGE as well, FWA, which is Financial Women's Association of Singapore, is a nonprofit platform that champions female success, right, in both workplace and personal lives. We believe strongly that we need champions and role models to speak about such topics. So it is then up to corporate bigwigs and role models, right, to then stand up, to speak, to share, and then provide and open the floor to these discussions, which will then also, help to get other companies to share and to address these issues.
Okay, we have one question from the floor, which I find very interesting. Which department in the organization should be responsible to oversee diversity, analyze the data, and provide the check and balance? I am fully aware that there is a new nomenclature or a role, Chief Diversity Officer, that I've seen in some organizations. And both Dr. Sarapol and Dr. Ken, I think, you are also in fairly distinct roles. So maybe can we share who do we think is most responsible? In my view, the whole organization is responsible. As Peter also said, it is very much the tone from the top, but nevertheless, in terms of actually being concrete and substantive, where should this sit? It being human capital management. Maybe I start with you, Dr. Sarapol.
Normally, when we think of this, we would think the HR department would be responsible. But as we have discussed and we hear from Peter that there need to be tone from the top. And for the exchange role, we are not talking about diversity within the exchange, but we are also talking about diversity of the whole industries. So I think having it centralized perhaps in the strategy department could be at least one that you can place the driving force of all every department within organization to gear toward driving diversity within exchange as well as all the listed companies.
Chin Lu, any comments on that?
Yeah, at EDGE, we have certified more than 200 companies across the globe, right? And as well, we're starting to certify companies in Singapore, in Middle East, in Japan, traditionally where, these you could argue is challenging countries that have not been leaders in the D&I space. So we do speak to everyone from HR, from DEI personnel to the boardroom. So very often a decision, for example, to commit and report on DEI, which is what EDGE certification is about, right? You do report, you plan, you strategize, and you disclose. It has to come from the top. So it has to be a leadership buy-in, because with the EDGE seal that recognizes a commitment from a company, it is publicly displayed, right? So that the image is very important. So I think I firmly believe that it has to be top down, but also if you pair it with bottom up approaches where business line managers are trained to understand why D&I is important, it's part of the KPIs, is part of their success factors, is part of remuneration, it does activate, all the stakeholders in the company to then make sure that it succeeds. So like you said, it is an all-round effort across the organizations and, a bottom-up, top-down approach and the mid-level, right, of line managers is certainly very important to make it happen.
Dr. Ken, for Bursa, for example, any specific challenges? I mean, you are definitely in the driving seat, and I know that you are very much a data person. So for Malaysian companies, is there any specific messages that we have investors out there listening to us? Any specific messages that you have, in terms of how we are making progress?
Yeah, I think the main message is that we need to have a sense of a collective responsibility, because nothing beats the power of stakeholder pressure and scrutiny when it comes to advancing a certain agenda, including DEI. So this sense of collective responsibility is where everyone takes ownership and everyone takes a role to push the capital market along. But just to add, I concur totally with the other two panelists that it should cut across functions when it comes to diversity. Now, Bursa alone, we have a group sustainability because Bursa is a PLC. At the same time, we are frontline regulator. So Dr. Surapal, you're absolutely right. Capital market as well as ourselves taking the lead from corporate strategy to the regulation side to group sustainability to HR. And it comes both ways, tone from the top and also the bottom up things like what Chin was saying. So totally concur. But the shared responsibility and ownership up and down the organization and across the market is what we're looking for.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes before we wrap up. So perhaps, I could actually be pretty much targeted in terms of the messaging to the chairs and CEOs of companies in particular, the same question that I had posed to Peter Grauer, right? If there have been a whole slew of action items that are deployable for sure, but what would be the one word that you would choose to really inspire DEI within your respective organizations and what you do? Dr. Surapal?
I think this is something that we need to push for, continuously pushing. So I would choose the word persistence. I think we have the aim of 30%. We still have a few way to go. And I think we have come to the point that it is recognized that there are benefits. So I think the matter now is just execution, and we need to do not give up.
I like that. So it's persistence. Dr. Ken?
Yes, I wanted to say a commitment, but it's just another way to express what Dr. Surapal has just said. Yeah.
Okay, Chin Lu, last word.
I think it's prioritization. So I think, in the spectrum of E, S, and G, which a lot of companies need to report on now, they've prioritized environment factors. And for good reason, right? The planet Earth needs that. But in addition to that, I would love to see companies elevate their S reporting and prioritizing their S, the social pillar, because I do see it as a sort of a second distant cousin to environment right now. So I think really to move the needle and not to see grass grow continually, is to prioritize S. And with that prioritization will come the commitment, the measurement, the tracking, and the reporting. So
thank you. We've come to the end of the session. So I really want to be able to say a big thank you to Dr. Surapal, Dr. Ken, and also Chin Lu for joining us at Maybank's Invest ASEAN. To wrap up, perhaps please allow me just a couple of minutes to kind of encapsulate both parts of the conversation that we have just had. For me, the key things perhaps are 5 in terms of key takeaways. Firstly is that quotas and KPIs need to be augmented, in my view, by advocacy beyond just the boardroom. These advocacy initiatives must also include top leaderships. Secondly, increased and specific disclosure requirements by investors, regulators, and policymakers to expedite demographic representation. And I think we heard today all three panelists, Dr. Sarapal, Dr. Ken, and Chin Lu, have greatly emphasized that. The third point for a takeout is that focus on equity, something that sits in the middle of DEI and perhaps gets a bit less attention, is that the focus on equity is crucial given very established practices of unequal access to opportunities. My fourth, perhaps, point is that DEI definitely is not a compliance exercise or a mere reporting tool. Rather, it is a competitive advantage for human capital management, very important for competitiveness in all organizations. And last but not least, there is ROI in diversity, equity, and inclusion, if not returns on sustainable investments, as we heard also this morning. So with that, thank you again, panelists, and I now hand the stage back to Seng Yao. Thank you.
Okay, a big thank you to Dato' Amy and the panelists for your insights and sharing on DEI. We will now go into a brief intermission for lunch and resume the next session, which is titled Institutional Crypto Trading in ASEAN at 1:30 p.m. Singapore time. With cryptocurrencies going into free fall, our panelists will attempt to address the question why institutional establishments are adding resources to build infrastructure to facilitate crypto trading. We will end this webinar now. Do enjoy your lunch, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you very much.